In the next couple of chapters, I'll show you how to use the Precompose option. If you have the exercise files, go ahead and open the Precompose 1 Move project. In the next chapter, we'll use the second project called Precompose Leave. When you open the project, it's very simple. There's only one composition called Wired Fruit. I'll open that. And inside this composition, there are 5 layers. The top layer is a 3D animation of a wireframe apple. And layers 2 and 3 are a title layer and a subtitle. And in the background, you have 2 movies that are blended together. If I select the top 3 layers and press E for effects, you can see that I have the drop shadow effect applied to all 3 layers. Of course, because I have 3 different drop shadow effects, every time I update the drop shadow on the apple, I have to make sure I copy and paste the same settings to the other 2 layers. So it might not be the most efficient way of working, but it does allow me to keep things simple and do the animation in one comp. Now, when you're nesting compositions, generally speaking, you're planning ahead and you're deciding which layers should be in which comp. But in the real world, quite often inspiration hits in the middle of a project. So let's say I'm working away and suddenly I decide, I'd really like to be able to move all these layers at the same time, or maybe scale them as a group. In a previous lesson, we showed you how to use parenting with a null object so you could transform layers as a group. However, one drawback of parenting is that you can't apply one effect to the parent and have it apply to all the children as well. Obviously, some effects I can just apply to each layer individually. But there are many effects, in particular the effects that are in the distort category. You often want to apply these to a group of layers. That's because effects like displacement map, as well as others such as wave warp, twirl, turbulent displace, and so on, they work with this idea of having a distortion field. And if I apply one of these effects to each layer individually, I get a completely different look. For instance, if I applied the twirl effect to each layer individually, they would each twirl around their own center. So that's why nesting compositions is very useful, because not only do you get all the benefits of parenting, but you can also apply effects to the group. And again, that's great in theory. But in the real world, sometimes inspiration hits in the middle of a project and you weren't planning ahead. And that's where Precompose comes in. So let's look at how it works. The first thing we need to do is select the layers that we want to group together. In this example, that's layers 1, 2, and 3. You'll notice I've actually locked the background layers so you don't accidentally select them. So with the layers I want to group selected, I'll go to the Layer menu and select Precompose from the very bottom of the menu. And later on you can learn the shortcut. When the Precompose dialog opens, you'll notice it has 2 options. One of them is grayed out. And the reason that the Leave All Attributes is grayed out is because I have multiple layers selected. If I only had one layer selected, I would have a choice. In the next chapter, I have an example where we'll use the Leave All Attributes option. So the idea here is that we're taking a group of layers, we're maintaining their attributes, and we're creating a single composited frame from that group. So what does Move All Attributes actually mean? In After Effects, the word attributes simply refers to everything that's applied to a layer. With a text layer, it means the font and the stroke and the color and so on. And for all layers, it means what mask or effects might be applied, blending modes, as well as the status of any of these switches. In addition, the value for any transformations, as well as, of course, any keyframes that are applied, would all be considered attributes. Another important attribute is the relationship that layers have in time. For instance, if you trim the layer, that would be an attribute. And also, if you had moved the layers in time, so that different layers started at different points in time, they would all be attributes. So the relationship that layers have to each other will be maintained after you precompose. So the idea here is that we're going to move all the attributes into a new composition. We'll give that comp a useful name. Let's call it Apple Group. Remember, naming your composition is just as important when you're precomposing as when you're creating a new comp from scratch. Now, if you read the fine print, it says use this option to place the currently selected layers together into a new intermediate composition. And why didn't it just say into a new composition? What does it mean by intermediate? What After Effects is trying to tell you is that the composition you're about to create, called Apple Group, will be an intermediate composition between the current composition and the original source. In other words, the new composition will be rendered before this composition. So in the rendering hierarchy, the original sources will be placed inside Apple Group, and that pre-comp will then appear inside this comp. So unlike nesting, where you're creating a composition that renders second, when you're precomposing, you're always creating an intermediate composition that renders before the current composition. The last option, Open New Composition, all it means is, after I click the OK button, will the pre-comp be open and forward, and that's what happens when it's enabled, or if it's not enabled, will the current comp be forward? For this first example, let's just leave it off so you can see what happens. I'll click OK, and my 3 layers in the timeline have been collapsed to 1 layer. Nothing appears to have changed in the composition. It looks exactly the same. But if I look over at the project panel, I can see I have a new comp called Apple Group. If I want to work with this pre-comp, I can either open it from the project panel just like any other composition, or I can go down to the timeline and simply double-click. And that brings the Apple Group comp forward as a tab, so I can go back and forth between the current comp and the pre-comp. Now it's important to remember that my 3 individual layers are appearing in the pre-comp with all of the attributes, the effects, any of the switches and blending modes that were applied, and I can continue to edit these individually. But in the current comp, I now have 1 layer that I can animate as a group. So again, I get all the benefits of parenting. I can move it around, I can scale it, and so on. I'll undo back to being centered. But I also have the benefit of being able to apply any of the distortion effects, such as a wave or turbulent displace, to the group of layers. Now, if that's the first time you ever saw precomposing in action, it might have seemed a bit confusing and a bit long-winded because I had to put it in context and explain what was happening. But let me undo back to before I precomposed. Here's my 3 layers that are selected. And let me show you how quick and easy it actually is once you know how it all works. So again, I've selected my layers and I've decided I need to have these as a group. So I select Layer, Precompose. I give my group a useful name. I don't have a choice when I'm grouping layers, so I always do Move All Attributes. And this time, let's select Open New Composition so you can see the difference. I select OK, and this time the pre-comp is forward. So here are my 3 layers in Apple Group. And if I bring the current comp forward, there's my single layer that I can now animate as a group. So if you think about it, if you were organized and you were planning ahead and you knew you needed these layers in their own composition, you might have created this composition first, placed the layers inside, and then taken Apple Group and nested it in the next composition, added the backgrounds, and so on. So precomposing is just another option for nesting compositions. It just allows you to do it later on without planning ahead. It's also important to remember that when you precompose, you'll end up with a comp that is just a regular composition. You might call it a pre-comp, but that just means that it renders first. Remember, these layers are going to render first, and then the result of this composition with its alpha channel, remember you have transparency here, will be nested in the main composition. Once you start creating multiple compositions, it's a good idea to store the precomps in a subfolder. So I might want to create a folder here called precomps, and I would drag any of my precomps into that folder and keep things organized. So now that we have the precomp created and we have a single layer to work with, in the next movie we'll apply the warp effect, animate it, and also tidy up the project to make it more efficient.